So we're going to enter our final panel here. We're going to transition. Malcolm is going to moderate this session. This is what we have. Sorry, post-fire considerations. This is functionally the fifth key message of the science synthesis. And we'll ask Brandon, Dana, and Dawn to come up here. And Kristen is setting up your spaces, and I'll turn it over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Steve. I figured that since I went from being up on the stage to over here, they were at least going to give me a hat where I could show that I was changing my thing. But I guess for some reason they're too cheap, right, Steve? So in any case, what we're going to do is transition here to management interventions after the fire. And we've got three folks that are going to be talking about this message. I want to start before I introduce each one of them with a little bit of context. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So just to give some general context to apply to what each of these folks is going to talk about, certainly two of the main drivers changing wildfire and post-wildfire conditions are, as Jamie pointed out at the beginning, the incredible increase in the size of high severity patches. And so, for instance, if you look at the slide on the left, you'll see one of these high severity patches. And what I wanted to remind people about is that if you look at the bottom of that slide, there's a general consensus that in Western conifers that are wind dispersed, most of the seed is limited to landing within 300 feet of the tree that it's coming from. Look at the middle picture, you'll see the outline of the 2014 King Fire. The red is showing the areas of high severity. And if you look at the size of the high severity patch in that thing, it is 30,000 feet across, almost, well, 5.5 miles across in that area. And so just a ballpark figure would be that basically 98% of that area is going to be beyond the seed dispersal distance of most Western conifers. The other thing that's going on when you have these large patch sizes, and particularly extensive fires of this nature, is that the restoration and remediation project becomes much more complex. You're dealing with multiple burn conditions, multiple ownerships, multiple types of different geographic and topographic conditions out there. The other factor that, of course, is really changing some of this dynamic is climate change. And in particular, to continue with the reforestation angle, the microclimate conditions for seedlings that are being faced out there with these kind of climate change conditions is much more extreme. It's increased the amount of mortality we have. And if you think about some of these lower elevation sites, many of them after high severity burns have a really strong potential to convert to other vegetation types, particularly shrublands. The other thing that's going on, of course, with climate change is you're amping up the weather conditions often that occur during the burn, and particularly for chaparral systems, it can mean that you're denuding the landscape of any vegetation, which really makes them prone to debris flow effects once you get rain after these high severity fires. And so with that said, we're going to have three particular talks here. Brandon Collins is going to start out first talking about post-fire landscape restoration and remediation. He'll be followed by Dana, who will be talking about reforestation efforts and how that fits into post-fire recovery. And then Don Lindsay will be joining us from the California Geological Survey, talking about debris flow events. And I want to briefly mention a person, Mark Meyer, who is very much part of this team, but could not be here today to join us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon.
All righty. Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be talking about this. I want to acknowledge Malcolm for a moment. Malcolm pulled together our key message, which was no small feat, right? We all sort of wrote small sections individually. Malcolm compiled them, put them in a single voice, and then trimmed down the words significantly. That is not an easy task, and thank you, Malcolm. So let me start with, well, it's actually frankly going to be all photos, but they're hopefully going to tell a story about how we think about post-fire landscapes. And I think we've already hit on the idea that fires, especially wildfires, it's not enough just to consider it binary, right? Just to count acres, right? We've already heard from Jamie before, where Jamie talked about at least differentiating high severity from low, moderate, and unchanged. And I think that's a huge step forward. We need to do that. We need to get better than just counting acres and saying they went up or they went down, or we did more treatment, less treatment. What's going on in those acres is super important. So with regard to a post-fire landscape, we sort of are at this stage where we need to be taking these large-scale landscape level assessments of the fire, where we ask really, frankly, two questions. One being, where did the fire degrade, maintain, or improve ecological integrity? Okay, that's a big question, right? That's probably cheating. That's like 3 questions. But the second question being, okay, where it degraded ecological integrity, is it worth the investment to try to change that trajectory? So let's walk through a couple examples. Okay. Here's an example here of an area where clearly you could clearly see fire degraded the ecological integrity. Why? Well, it's high severity, but that in alone is not enough. The key here is the scale. The scale at high severity here. You probably can't totally tell from the picture, but it goes on for hundreds of acres here, and probably even larger than that. And we're seeing that. Malcolm pointed that out with the King Fire. We see it in so many fires. These large patches of contiguous high severity are clearly degraded condition ecologically. Now, intervening, does it make sense? In this case, probably yes. Great access. I actually took this picture from a road, right? Fairly flat, fairly operable lands, and it's something where we could make a difference. And the key being, make a decision quickly and get in there and start changing that trajectory, because lots of things change and start to get out of your control very quickly. I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, here's an example. Here's an example of where you could easily argue that fire either maintained or probably improved ecological integrity, right? Yes, you see a couple trees die, but that's not the end of the world, right? Jamie pointed out that we have so many areas that are in this higher level stand density index that we need trees to die, and it's okay if they die in a fire. In this case, we had a couple trees die. We had some surface fuels get consumed. That's a great outcome. And it's not over, frankly, because it's the beginning of like what Scott was talking about. We need to get in there and do more work. But in that case, nothing to do, right? Nothing to do immediately from a post-fire standpoint. Here's another condition. This is the edge of a small patch of high severity. Do we need to get in there and reforest right away? Maybe not, right? Maybe there's opportunity for seed to get in there. As Malcolm talked about, there's some dispersal distance we can usually count on, right? And in the end, we need to think about the landscape and the heterogeneity. We're starting to learn more about things like spotted owls. Spotted owls actually really thrive on landscape heterogeneity, including areas of complete mortality, small patches of complete mortality, an important characteristic for their foraging. Here's another example. Oops, not yet. Here's another example of an area. Yes, maybe a high severity area. Maybe we don't see trees immediately, but maybe we think about a transition, well, at least a transition from pre-fire, but maybe even something that would be restoration to something that existed many generations before, that was more oak dominated, right? Oaks can resprout. They're very resilient to even a subsequent fire under short intervals. We need to stop getting so focused on conifers. The oaks have some high value as well. Here's another example. Whoops, I'm not hitting it right. Here's another example of a transition. We all, as foresters, don't love shrubs, but there's a place for shrubs in these ecosystems at small scales, right? Not at giant scales where we converted large patches of forest to large patches of shrubs. That's not something we really see as an ecological benefit. Okay, here's a picture of an area that burned at high severity about 10 years before this photo was taken, and that has transitioned to shrubs. Now, this is a very predictable transition in a lot of areas, very productive soils, lots of moisture available. The point of this picture is to show that we knew that would happen, yet we didn't intervene, and we're left with limited decision space here. If you want to change that condition right now, which, by the way, from a fuel perspective is a terrible condition, high fuel continuity, lots of biomass. Live shrubs are not super available to burn all the time, but under the worst conditions they are, and especially if you intersperse them with dead trees. That can be a terrible fuel bed under the right conditions. But the problem is our options are super late right now, or we don't have many options to get any economic recovery, frankly, and everything's coming at a cost, and that's a huge cost to deal with that condition. Here's another condition. You might notice the little tree in front, right? And say, hey, yay, we have trees coming back. That's not a great hope that that tree is going to survive, right? Because of all the fuel sitting around that tree, because of a deferred decision, essentially, right? We decided not to do anything about the wood, right? So we chose not to get value out of that wood potentially from a salvage standpoint, and we left the legacy of that fuel on the landscape that then compromises what little regeneration we might get from that. So the point being of these slides, make a decision quickly, but anyway, make the right decision as it pertains to the landscape and thinking about the next fire. Here's my last slide. Again, if you notice, I'm kind of cheating on my 3-slide limit that I keep animating, so I'm getting really like 9 slides out of it. But here we go. So this is obviously 2 very different conditions following the same fire. This is a fire in 2007 up on the Plumas National Forest. On one side, we see a very decisive and quick decision, or a quick ability to change the condition after the 2007 fire in reforest. On the other side, we see what you might consider a passive approach, where we did not make decisions, or maybe the decision was we didn't want to do anything there. Okay, those resulted in quite different trajectories. This is, I think, 14 years after that fire. In fact, this is right before the Dixie Fire, only about a month before the Dixie Fire. I'm cheating here. This is not a repeat photo, but it's kind of capturing the same juxtaposition now, where we have on the left side of the right panel, we have an area where there was no management following the 2007 fire. Then it burned in the Dixie Fire, and it burned really, really badly again, not surprising. Then on the other side, we have an area that was managed after the 2007 fire, and it sort of survived the Dixie Fire, right? Because they had very different fuel profiles, very different vulnerabilities. So we have this potential to change these trajectories, right? We have to commit to some things that are a little uncomfortable for sure, right? But we know what is going to happen. And frankly, we can't be surprised anymore about reburning. It's not a one-off anymore. We were surprised under the Chips Fire, if a lot of you know that area on the Northern Sierra. Whoa, that reburned in 10 years. And now we're seeing it over and over and over again. It's not a surprise anymore. It's something we frankly need to expect. I want to end again. Here I am with animation, and I'm cheating on my slides. But I'm going to end real quick with a good friend of ours who was lost this past year. And so much of my understanding of the post-fire environment, a lot of our options from the management side came from Ryan Tompkins. I think many others in this room had that interaction with him, and we miss Ryan terribly, but a lot of the things that he taught us sort of carry on today. Thank you.
Right, Brandon, thank you very much for that, and particularly for the acknowledgement of Ryan there. I was going to put you in the timeout penalty box for the slide violation, but you got your way out of that with the tribute to Ryan. Dana, you're up.
Okay, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is things that came from Ryan as well. So the reforestation work group of this task force identified 1.5 million acres of reforestation need from just 3 recent years of wildfire in California, 2019 to 2021. That does not account for the additional thousands of acres of loss from 2021. From 2022 to 2024, or acres not reforested from fires prior to 2019. Currently, reforestation is averaging 6,000 to 15,000 acres a year on National Forest System lands and a few thousand acres a year on private lands. That's less than 10% of what we need to be reforesting to reach goals to meet our backlog within 10 years. Reforestation is most effective when it's done in a quick time period after wildfire, as Brandon shown. However, for reforestation to be successful, we need to, in general, have low levels of initial surface fuel loading and low levels of competing vegetation so that seedlings persist and grow. The biggest impediment to reforestation, is still how do we get enough acres prepared to be successfully reforested? Regulatory barriers slow things down substantially and don't necessarily make for better outcomes. And lack of infrastructure and workforce capacity still are significant impediments. The picture on the left is from ongoing reforestation efforts in 2021 in that spring on that large high severity patch of the King Fire. It's a small portion of that large high severity patch that was being treated at that time. The photo on the right is that fall of that year. It's a similar high severity patch from the 2021 Caldor Fire, both in El Dorado County in the headwaters to Sacramento, important watersheds. Oops, I don't want to do that yet. We're faced with patches that are tens of thousands of acres in size and forest types where tens of acres of size would be a large opening under their ecological disturbance regime. Reforestation generally results in plantations. There's currently a debate on the best arrangement for the trees going into those plantations. However, hotter, drier conditions demand that we create areas that are resistant and become resilient to fire, regardless of those arrangements. The photo on the left is the Middle Creek Plantation, which was established in the mid-1900s, around 1950, following the Middle Creek Fire. The key here is that this plantation was effectively established, and then it was maintained to continue to address accumulating fuels and accumulating density. This photo is after it burned in the 2021 Caldor Fire. It provides continued forest cover as well as a seed source. Reforestation can also be damaging. The photo on the right is a plantation that was established in that same time frame. Within the wild and urban intermix, it's riddled with beetle-killed trees, and it's now an exacerbated issue for fire severity in that community. Did I want to get there? So fire is a key part of the solution here. It's a natural process in these systems, and wherever possible, we need to be setting up these reestablishing forests so that they can and do burn at an intensity and a severity that facilitates the development of these forests to become resilient. We also need to be using all of the other methods in our toolbox to address accumulating fuels and density. There's a lot of knowledge on how to successfully and effectively reforest: nursery practices, outplanting techniques, maintenance. However, given the size of the deforested patches that we're facing, as well as the era of megafires and droughts that we've come into, we must consider how systems interrelate and recognize that facilitation as well as competition are important factors in building forest resilience. While appropriate in some contexts and operationally the easiest, there is no natural analog to the high-density gridded tree patterns devoid of other vegetation. In active fire forests, a mix of individual trees, clumps, and openings create resilient forest structure with shrubs, grasses, and forbs intermixed. By focusing planting in microsites, more conductive to tree growth, and varying the number of seedlings, species composition, and spatial configurations, there is evidence that we can more quickly establish fire resilient conditions. Where landscape resilience is the goal of reforestation, efforts need to establish lower tree densities using genetics and spatial patterns that reinforce the development of resilience. Recognizing there are also other really important reasons and objectives for reforestation, landscape context is key. As fires move across our ownerships, it's critical that we coordinate and leverage work across boundaries as well. What is done or is what is not done on one ownership boundary really can negatively or positively affect others in the area. So I cheated and I got a fourth slide I'm very excited about. So over the past 2 years, agencies, industry, and partners have really invested heavily in addressing the pinch points of the reforestation pipeline. We've been expanding nursery capacity, coordinating and increasing seed collection pretty substantially this year, very excited. Investments in innovative and new partnerships, the establishment of emergency forest restoration teams, which are coordinating recovery on non-industrial private lands, but they're also investing and supporting and coordinating cross-ownership and cross-agency efficiencies. We've got a reforestation pipeline partnership with a cooperative that's open to everybody, and multiple workforce development efforts that this task force is really invested in. And with that, I'll hand it over to Don.
All right, thank you, Dana. Don, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, everyone. Whoop, jumped the gun here. Good afternoon. I'm here to talk about runoff-induced post-fire debris flows, which are one of the largest hazards immediately following fire for the first couple of years. Looking at the left panel on the slide, wildfire reduces vegetative cover and alters soil properties, causing rainfall to quickly convert to runoff that then bulks by sediment, and it is concentrated and flows downstream. The unique characteristic of debris flows is that they often form surge fronts composed of large boulders and woody debris that are pushed along by a mud slurry similar to wet concrete. Debris flows can be fast-moving, easily overtop channel banks and cause significant damage along their flow path. Looking at the center panel, post-fire debris flows occur in areas of steep slopes burned at moderate and high or high severity, and where there's available sediment to be entrained in bulk runoff, and are often triggered by short duration, high intensity rainfall events. They occur across a wide range of physiographic conditions throughout the state, ranging from forested terrain in the far reaches of Northern California to chaparral and shrub-dominated terrain in Southern California. Looking at the far right-hand panel, post-fire debris flows often result in large impacts to life, property, and infrastructure. And this photos on this slide on the right-hand side illustrate these types of impacts from fires that span, again, a wide range of physiographic conditions throughout the state. We currently use models developed by the USGS to predict the likelihood, triggering rainfall, and volume of potential or post-fire debris flows. Collectively, these models allow us to predict the where and when post-fire debris flows will occur and how large they will be. The image to the left shows an example of the USGS likelihood model output around the community of Mount Baldy, which was impacted this summer as a result of the 2024 bridge fire. Results suggest that given a typical rainfall event in the area, the likelihood of post-fire debris flows occurring above the community ranges from 60 to over 80%. The USGS model results are used by state watershed emergency response teams as well as federal burned area emergency response teams to evaluate post-fire hazards and recommend mitigations to reduce the hazards. This information is communicated to local stakeholders and emergency response personnel who use it to develop emergency response plans. So the question is, how can we improve? The following outline on the right-hand panel illustrates three ways which we can improve current methods. First, the current USGS model generally do best predicting hazards in Southern California, where the models originated from, including physiographic conditions outside of Southern California may benefit future model development or new models that can better predict post-fire debris flow hazards across the state. We need to develop better methods to predict post-fire runoff, including peak flow and duration. And lastly, we need to develop better methods to parameterize hydrologic models in order to predict post-fire runout, including inundation, extent, flow depth, and peak flow velocities. To address the areas that need improvement and reduce occurrence and damage of post-fire debris flows, we need to first improved data and models. This includes developing a comprehensive database of post-fire debris flows across the state and improving or developing new models to better predict runoff and runout of post-fire debris flows. 2, we need to provide planning and design guidance to better ensure that infrastructure can accommodate impacts associated with post-fire debris flows. An example of this is to build road crossings capable of withstanding post-fire debris flows where the potential is high. And lastly, we need to analyze debris flow risk at the landscape scale to identify and prioritize areas to receive fuels and reforestation treatments to reduce fire size and burn intensity within high-risk basins. And I'll conclude by, if we are successful in achieving these goals, we will improve community resilience against post-fire debris flow hazards. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Don. Appreciate it. And as we get into questions here, I'll throw one at the panel to start with. Something that seems to course through all three of these conversations is that disturbances, be they debris flows or fires, are operating at a much coarser scale than the ecosystem originally experienced for many years. So how do we take events like climate change or extreme weathers or extreme, fire events and be able to reduce the kind of homogeneous, large-scale effects that are occurring out there? I'll throw that at anyone who's willing to pick it up. Okay, Brandon, you go.
Malcolm, you answer that question. No, okay, so if you're starting in the post-fire context, if you're thinking about it in the pre-fire context, is it either one?
Post-fire context,
Okay.
like what can you do with that?
I think that's a huge thing we need to think about. I think traditionally, at least in forestry, we tend to focus on the stand level, right? We do our treatments, we think about the longevity and the sustainability at a stand level, and somehow or another, and it may be already be changing, frankly, just because of tools available, GIS and all those things, the remote sensing data. But we need to start thinking about planning at a landscape level. Yes, the landscape is consistent, consists of stands at smaller units, but you need to tie them all together. And I think that in its own right should be an objective, is if nothing else, break up continuity. Right? Not just focus on that bad area and that bad area and that bad area, but how do they fit together and how do we change their trajectory over the landscape? So my sort of weaselly answer is, let's start planning at a landscape scale.
I will turn it over to either Wade or Jennifer if you have any questions or comments.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think I'm so proud of the fact that in government we have incredible scientists. And so I think it's really affirming for us that we have federal and state scientists leading this panel. 3 very specific questions. One is I learned a lot around, that the fact that reforestation can happen in effective ways and ineffective ways, and that there are certain practices that make sense and that don't make sense. So I'm interested to know if there's general alignment now among those doing reforestation on the practices that are going to be beneficial versus that are going to be counterproductive. So that's number one. Number 2 is you piqued my interest when you said that there were potential regulatory barriers to preparing sites for reforestation. I'd ask you to name names, which agency, no, just kidding. But I do think that's an area for more exploration, because we want to cut the green tape. It's so silly that we in the environmental world are making it harder to do the environmental things that we need to do. But it just, if you can give a little bit more color to that. And then third is, at the end of the day, it sounds like much less reforestation is happening than we would like to happen. And so I'm interested in what are the primary barriers? Is it funding? Is it seeds? Is it workforce? Is it the vision and plans? So those are 3 big questions, but if you can just give a little bit of answer that to start to guide us, it'd be great.
Okay, so first I want to build on Brandon's answer because I think it contributes to part of that. We need to stop planning at a landscape level and implement at a landscape level. Planning is not getting us there. In terms of, good reforestation versus bad reforestation, I think there's a pretty wide agreement that we need to address fuel loading. And that we need to have, low enough competing vegetation for trees to survive and grow. They need to get through that period of fire risk before we can get to resilience. There is a lot of disagreement currently on how best to get there, but we know we need to get there quickly. There isn't one, reforestation unfortunately is really complex. It's about landscape context, and there is not one right thing to do everywhere across the landscape. It is very context specific. In terms of regulation slowing things down, we've got a lot of resources we're trying to protect. But for example, during the Caldor fire, I went to a couple areas during the fire that you had multiple masticators, multiple feller bunchers, and fire crews all operating, treating extensive landscapes. We can't do that without it being on fire. And we need to if we're going to get ahead of this issue. And then your third question, I'm sorry, you'll have to go back to that.
Just what's the limitation? What's the fundamental limitation?
Oh, the workforce, money, people, conditions, a drive to do so. Like I said, I've seen it done when it's on fire. We're not doing that when it's not. And I'm sorry, you brought a forester up on the panel, so.
Great. Well, I'll follow up. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate obviously in this state as across the West and even in the Southeast now for post disaster. Follow up is a huge thing. When I was listening to you, I'm like, oh, I'm so glad you guys are bringing all of this up because it's such a challenge to, after a post-fire, you've got in the state millions of acres, and where do you put your attention? So first, I get a lot of confusion over, it's one thing for stabilizing the landscape. That's your burned area emergency work. That's just keeping the soil on the landscape. But then they quickly follow up, well, now go in and reforest. And as you said, it's not that easy. Do you have the seedlings? Do you have the source? Do you have the workforce? And then also, do you have the authorities, the ability to go out of fire, where we're really good at our emergency management on that, but not so much recognizing the emergency work that we need to do in the post-fire landscape. So I really appreciate you guys bringing that up and forward on here. I wanted to take just a little bit, if you had well, I'm going to ask you, what kind of research or work would we need would be most beneficial for the next 2 to 3 years? What's our gaps out there that we need to know? Like, do you have everything you need right now? You know what you need to do on that landscape. But if you had to say, what do we need to focus on? What would be beneficial? The questions to ask, the research to do. Malcolm, I include you in this too. For post-fire, any of the topics we've talked about today, I'd be really curious.
I got a response.
I bet
I'll respond and I'll put it in the context of post-fire hazards, specifically touching on debris flow hazards. And we've heard discussions. There are some great limitations with workforce and so what I'm hearing is that there's a need to identify areas to parse out the landscape into treatable areas where you have limited resources. You can put those resources to have the best effect, the biggest bang. And work that the BWG program has done recently has strived to develop methods and improve existing methods to do a statewide mapping effort that in the context of debris flows, we can now look at in a pre-fire context where all of the highest highest risk slopes exist. And then you would pass that information on to folks that are in the reforestation and fuels treatment fields to use it as a means to prioritize certain basins or certain areas that you concentrate your limited resources in to maximize the benefits. So that,
I'll add real quick. I think one of the things that we could really learn a lot about is burning in post-fire landscapes. Honestly, we cannot deal with the debris. We can't get it off. And so it is a major challenge to reforestation. And so things like burning with drones. Can we burn with drones in high severity areas where we've done some piling? And then also, can we do underburning in areas that burned at low to moderate severity within, say, 5 years, and really capitalize on that good work and start to really change the trajectory? Because we have, you're going to get a pulse of some of the wood that came down that was killed, but you still have live trees. Well, let's capitalize on that, burn up that pulse and start really pushing that system into a much different trajectory. So if you want a simple answer, I think that could be one.
Know your audience,
If I
simple.
can chime in, even though I'm going to take my moderator hat off for the moment, but I do think there's a real lack of understanding about how these forests used to regenerate on their own in active fire systems. And we have much to learn from how that actually played out. I would be the first to admit we've had tremendous success reforesting areas, planting trees in grids, but successfully doing it to reestablish forests in these conditions after high severity burns. But I think that fundamentally the conditions are changing, both with climate change and with the intensity of fire. And it behooves us to at least start to try experimenting with different planting arrangements, different responses to paying attention to microsites and planting trees in the wettest and least fire-prone areas. Do we know exactly how to do it? No. But I do think it's something that it's worth our time to invest in that research and that understanding so that we could improve our reforestation practices where they need improvement.
Thank you so much. Joe, we're coming to the end of our meeting. Thank you for sticking with us a little bit longer than we scheduled. We'll just do one or two more questions and then we will work to conclude.
Great, thanks, Wade. And so panel, really appreciate all the insight. And Dana, I just want to thank you personally for all your work you've done on the El Dorado where recently was. And some of what you talked about too, Brandon, I mean, we need to get in there quickly to change the trajectory post-fire in that environment. And what we see across Region 5 is we're not able to do that. You look at the Caldor, you look at Mosquito, 2+ years of planning before you're even there's any action happening. And like, Dana, you shared, we get it. We have the equipment, we have the workforce to get in there and to actually start doing things. And so, if you were to focus on some areas, what would those be as far as like how we kind of change that trajectory? What are some actions we could be taking to get in and do more rapid planning, figuring out where and how we want to treat? Because we need to be able to do that before we can even get to some of the reforestation discussions and all the work and the great work you guys have been doing along then. So what would you suggest, areas we could focus on to make that happen?
There's been some great work on some assessment frameworks, and Brandon talked about that, looking at where can we beneficially treat. I think, making sure that we're protecting our communities is obviously a key one in the state, because the reburn on those landscapes is going to take out communities that didn't burn. I honestly think we need to be thinning or planning pre-fire in landscapes that haven't burned yet, to say, where is forest important to us to come back when it does burn, because it will. There are easily accessible areas. We can easily model and identify where fire is going to be most risk in the landscape, and focus areas there first. It may not be areas that we would focus on otherwise. Looking at landscape context, sometimes meadow restoration is going to be probably your first big entry, because you're going to have so much sediment coming down and you might want to catch it.
Yeah, to me, as I listen to this conversation, I've learned a lot, which is one of the benefits of this, of today. But from my perspective, this is something we control. If we are government, and whether it's federal, state, local, tribal, and we want to get more reforestation on the landscape, but our systems or our requirements or our traditions don't allow that, then we need to change that. You know, there are certain things that we don't control that make reforestation at scale difficult, but let's change the things that we do control. And Annalee gave a great example of, we've been talking to CAL FIRE about trying to get more prescribed fire on the ground through their teams at scale. And you identified that there are certain things that you can do during an emergency fire on contracting mobilization that you can't do outside of that. So we collectively changed state law to be able to do that. So I think there's an appetite on this task force to identify what those are. We just have to have the political will to get it done. So maybe, Sir Steve, I want to give you the last word as the person that invoked us here, but I'm hoping that what you put together as scientists and our scientific advisory panel in the beginning part of the year, our task force staff can reflect on that and then come back with some key takeaways around how it informs our action plan, because that's the name of the game. I mean, you guys are doing incredible work. This has been a great day, and we want it to mean something around how we continue to improve our work.
Well, thank you for that. And that was the charge, right? Was to independently and objectively look at the science, amass the science. So it's, like I said earlier, so it's decision relevant. If it's not decision relevant, it's not of utility to you as decision makers, and it's not of utility to the people actually doing the work on the ground, right? I do want to thank, like I said, we have 39 authors across all of these 6 chapters. Not a single person declined an invitation to participate, including the lead authors like Malcolm, like Chris. It's a big charge, right? And I think it's a testament both to their professionalism, but the degree of care that they have to store these landscapes, right? You see it in their voices. You see, I feel like I'm shaking when Brandon speaks, right? Which is wonderful. I mean, that is the kind of thing. And you saw that in a graph, I think that Jamie showed too, of just how much really we know what's going on here. We're not a data poor state. We're not a resource poor part of the world. I go all around the world trying to work with different countries to make better decisions around the changing climate and natural and working lands that don't have data, that don't have resources. We do, and also, and to your testament and you, Jen, too, willing to push us further and push us to do more. And also for Patrick. Patrick pushes on us with a lot of fervor as well, which I appreciate, because that's part of what makes this better. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending, and thank all the scientists that participated in this endeavor.
Yeah, huge thanks. Let's give a round of applause to all of you.